welcome back to the Dan Corder Show. South Africa's a movie. This is the watch party. Now, we love to end all of our shows with a big interview, and this one is massive. It concerns the state of journalism in South Africa and in the world, and how people, particularly powerful people, make a concerted effort, both in public and in private, in secret, to try and silence journalists and destroy their careers. Let's get into it. And I'm thrilled to welcome someone who you know all about through her many years of superb work covering the courts and the legal system and why big, powerful people are in trouble and why they don't want you to know about it across many channels, many platforms, many publications. She's got a new book that comes out tonight. And so this is our exclusive interview. So if you weren't at the book launch an hour ago, according to our taping in Johannesburg, you're in the right place. Please welcome renowned South African journalist Karyn Maughan is here. Knowledge people don't get a bigger cheer than when they come on the Dan Corder Show. It just doesn't happen.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
So let's start at the start. Everyone wants to know, you've got a new book. It's called I Will Not Be Silenced. Who's trying to silence you? What have you been doing?
Well, I think what essentially happened, what I'm quite well known for, is obviously that the former president, Jacob Zuma, made false and untrue claims that I had somehow got an unlawful access to his medical reports and then unlawfully published them. And the case was essentially about an alleged collusion between myself and the corruption prosecutor against Jacob Zuma, Billy Downer, which Jacob Zuma alleged violated provisions of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, which no one's ever been prosecuted before. And that we should spend 15 years in jail. And so what happened simultaneous to that, which I think is a very widespread phenomenon along all of our societies around the world, was that there was this massive kind of weaponized social media campaign against me, which we actually very usefully used in our case, because amongst other things, Duduzile Zuma, of course is Jacob Zuma's daughter, was saying things like, I would be someone's Vafi in prison, which essentially suggested that I should be raped in prison. You know, and obviously that's incredibly disturbing. But ultimately, the courts did find that this was an abusive prosecution, that it shouldn't have been proceeded. And they used that social media aspect to say that there was an ulterior purpose from the president, and that was to silence my reporting, that his own language about me, calling me racist, calling me all kinds of things, a propagandist, that he thought I was aligned with the National Prosecuting Authority, made it very clear that what he was doing was about silencing me. And it has that judgment, which is so amazing, has already been used to defend a number of journalists in other cases, because it's so far-reaching, you know? And I'm really proud of that. I think that anyone who has the courage to speak up and report specifically now, whoever they are, they must take sort of support in the fact that it will be stopped by the courts, you know?
Isn't that amazing? That's extraordinary. So I'm sure the book talks a little bit about that, but you were telling me before we started, you were just in Berlin meeting lots of other journalists around the world who have suffered the strategies of powerful people, whether it's business people or politicians or the police in countries all around the world that are trying to basically attack and silence the people who bring us the truth. Can you tell me a little bit about the different strategies that people use around the world, whether through the law, like slap suits, or through intimidation? And I mean, Karyn Maughan was also like, she was described as being like she would have been a Nazi propagandist if it was Nazi Germany by another publication, IOL, all these things. Tell me about the different strategies, both overhanded and underhanded, that powerful people are using to try and silence powerful journalists.
Well, I think we have to understand that globally we're seeing a massive rolling back of democracy. There's been a rise in a sort of right-wing populist nationalism across the world. There are very few exceptions to that. I think the FT did a story where they said about 10 incumbent governments being pushed out of office. And of course, that's democracy. That can be a positive thing. But what is it coming at the cost of? We've seen people like Donald Trump call journalists fake news. There is this concerted strategy to undermine any kind of aspect of democracy, accountability, and journalism is one of those things. So we're seeing attacks on the courts. We know that in South Africa. We're seeing attacks on civil society, and we're seeing attacks on journalists. And all of those attacks are very, very similar. It's always you're controlled by someone else. You're not a journalist for yourself. You're being controlled by the West. You're a spy. The same thing for civil society, those kind of allegations. If you're the judiciary, you're controlled by white monopoly capital. You're controlled by Stellenbosch. And there's a sense in which, it feeds into that kind of conspiracy-mindedness that people are not seeking accountability for accountability's sake, that they're doing it at the behest of powerful, shadowy forces that are not acting in the best interests of ordinary people. And that message has hit home for a lot of people. And we can see that with the election of Donald Trump. I think that when we analyze what happens, the role that social media has played as people have become more distrustful of journalists, more accepting of this, we can't trust journalists, we can't trust the media. Social media has elevated into a kind of position where it's literally shaping what people will believe and what will vote for. And I think as journalists, we need to start evaluating why is that? How do we push back? But how do we regain the trust of people who don't believe that we act in the interests of democracy? Because that is more concerning.
Now, I completely agree with everything you just said. The complication is that there are fake news journalists.
Yeah,
there are propagandists who pretend to be journalists who are not. And I would encourage anybody in, whether you're reading this website or you're doing this or whatever, you should be looking for the blind spots that those websites never, ever, ever look at. And you should be thinking about what those websites or those publications always talk about, and present as truth, rather than just, this is what a politician said. But Karyn, I think that we as an audience, as a public, need to learn how to spot the fake news propagandist calling themselves a journalist and then be able to tell that is different from journalists who are doing good work. What advice do you have for us, the plebs, on how to do that?
Well, if you see a claim that is overwhelmingly sensational, that is for instance, in America, there were claims that Kamala Harris was a communist. And obviously that was very successful with a Latino base that, has horrible experience of communism per se in their particular environments. But, and then there's all this AI stuff that seems very real and can convince someone who already has a predisposition. But if it's an overly sensational claim, if it's presented by a news website where there's questions, if it's the BBC, for example, and people will obviously say, those institutions are fake news, but someone with an established reputation like the BBC, like Al Jazeera, like the New York Times, then the chances of it being untrue are far less dramatic than if it's called xspot.com, and you've never heard of this thing and it's based in Russia. Then there's a real reason to be going, possibly not. And also the thing is that you'll see with life, it's very, very unusual to have a situation where it's black and white. Oftentimes, social issues, problematic issues are far more nuanced. So if there's a total absence of explanation for the other side, if it's literally one word, a one-way direction against a particular thing, chances are that is propagandistic. That there is an element of persuasion. And, you have to sort of go, what are the likelihoods of this being true? And then check up against, see the central claim that's being made, Google that and see who else is reporting this, who else is saying the same stuff. And, maybe it is true, but if it is true, there will be widespread media coverage of it because the global news environment will pick up on an important story and replicate it in different dimensions with different angles. But it will become immediately apparent that this is in fact true.
And for those of you who spend a lot of time on Twitter, if Chris XL says it, check.
Yeah.
Just make sure. Just make sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Karyn, I'm so excited to read your book. Tell me a little bit more about what else you go into that people can expect.
Well, I think the thing for me that I realized was that, I was just one in a long line of women who had been the targeting of this kind of silencing by the former president. And the one that there were two that broke my heart the most, both of which I reported on. And the first was Fezeka Kuzwayo, who was the person who accused him of rape. And she literally had to flee the country with her mom. And I remember as a young reporter, that was when I started reporting on Jacob Zuma, 26 years old, seeing people carrying a coffin in the street and saying she must be in it. Calling her Lucifer, calling her Satan, and using the exact same language that was used against, other journalists, other people, saying she was a spy. It was the same language, that she couldn't have done this on her own, that she had no agency. Mantuli Zuma, who was falsely accused of poisoning the former president and accused of collusion as a CIA spy, in a book written by our now sports minister, Gayton McKenzie. And I went to a spokesperson and I said, do you not believe, given that the NPA is not prosecuting her, that they've said there was no evidence of any poisoning, that it would be appropriate for you to apologize and retract those claims? Because he said that she'd been made pregnant by the CIA agent and she'd had an abortion. This is a deeply religious Zulu woman who still very much loves Jacob Zuma. It was so apparent to me when I interviewed her that she was absolutely heartbroken. She kept saying, I don't understand how he would believe that. And her life got crushed because I'm a middle-class white woman who had a company behind me, who was prepared to support me. A lot of the targets of this kind of stuff are not. They are black women, they are socially disempowered, they may not have access to the legal mechanisms that I do. And, Fezeka Kuzwa and Mantuli Zuma were two such women. And then obviously there was the attacks on Thuli Madonsela, there was the attacks on Sisi Kampepe, that the contempt judgment was emotional, which is of course code for a kind of sexist attack on the legitimacy of that judgment. Janet Love in the last elections was accused of being an agent. So it's the same language, it's the same thing. And it's the same idea that as a female, you can't possibly be doing things out of your own space of autonomy. You have to be controlled by someone else. So it's this kind of misogyny that's so toxic that it's almost poisonous, and it has deeply destructive implications for the women who get caught up in it.
Sure. I'm so glad that we had Karyn here to explain that to us. Karyn Maughan, thank you so much. Your new book, I Will Not Be Silenced, is out.
Thank you.
The book is out because you're watching the show. And that is our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back on Monday for the next episode of the Dan Corder Show. Remember, you can watch all of our episodes in full, absolutely free on eNCA.com. Have a blessed week, South Africa. Good night.